The decorated soldier's journey captain James Morrison had served the British royal family for 12 years. His chest displayed medals earned from 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 peacekeeping missions in Africa. The 38-year-old officer walked through London, Heathrow Airport with the same confidence he carried when protecting royalty at Buckingham Palace. Morrison was heading home to Scotland after completing a special security assignment for the royal household. He wore his dress uniform, as protocol required when traveling on official business. The dark blue jacket bore the golden insignia of the Royal Guard, and his polished boots clicked against the marble floor as he approached the check-in counter. The airline staff member, a young woman named Sarah, looked up from her computer screen. She noticed Morrison's military bearing and the numerous decorations on his uniform. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you today?" Morrison presented his boarding pass and identification. "Captain James Morrison, Royal Guard. I have a seat in business class for the Edinburgh flight." Sarah scanned his documents and frowned slightly. She called over her supervisor, a middle-aged man named David who had worked for the airline for 15 years. David examined Morrison's tickets and uniform with suspicious eyes. "I'm sorry, Captain, but we need to verify your credentials," David said coolly. "Anyone can wear a uniform these days." Morrison remained calm, though he felt a flash of irritation. He had never been questioned about his identity before, especially while in uniform. "Of course. Here's my military identification card and my palace security clearance." David barely glanced at the official documents. Instead, he seemed focused on Morrison's appearance. The captain was a tall, well-built black man with a dignified bearing that commanded respect wherever he went. His record was spotless, and his service to the crown had earned him commendations from senior officials. "These could be fake," David muttered, loud enough for other passengers to hear. "We've had problems with people impersonating military personnel." The comment stung Morrison deeply. He had risked his life serving his country and protecting the royal family. Now he was being treated like a criminal at an airport check-in counter. Other passengers began to stare, and Morrison felt the weight of their curious gazes. "Sir, I assure you my credentials are genuine," Morrison said firmly. "I can provide additional verification if needed." David shook his head dismissively. "I'm afraid we cannot allow you to board in business class. There's been a mistake with your booking. You'll need to take a seat in economy class and we'll need to inspect your luggage thoroughly." Morrison's jaw tightened. He had flown this route many times before without any issues. His booking was made through the royal household's travel department, and everything had been arranged properly. The sudden change felt deliberate and humiliating. "This is unacceptable," Morrison said quietly. "I request to speak with your manager immediately." David crossed his arms. "I am the supervisor on duty. My decision is final. You can take the economy seat or find another flight." The situation was escalating, and Morrison realized he was being discriminated against. His uniform, his service record, and his official documents meant nothing to this airline employee. The man's hostile attitude suggested this was about more than just verification procedures. The humiliation unfolds. Morrison stood at the check-in counter, feeling the eyes of dozens of passengers upon him. The supervisor, David, had made his accusations loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Whispers spread through the waiting area as people wondered what was happening with the uniformed soldier. "Please step aside, sir," David commanded. "You're holding up the line." Morrison moved to a corner near the counter, but he didn't give up. He pulled out his mobile phone and called his commanding officer at the palace. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. It was Sunday evening and most officials were off duty. Meanwhile, David instructed 2 security officers to approach Morrison. The guards were polite but firm as they asked him to accompany them to a private room for additional screening. Morrison felt his dignity crumbling with each step toward the security office. In the small windowless room, Morrison was asked to remove his jacket and boots. His medals clinked softly as he carefully hung his dress uniform on a plastic chair. The security officers searched through his belongings with thorough precision, examining every item twice. "This is completely unnecessary," Morrison said as calmly as he could manage. "I've provided all required identification and documentation." One of the security officers, an older man with graying hair, seemed uncomfortable with the situation. "I'm sorry about this, Captain. We're just following orders from the airline staff." For 2 hours, Morrison sat in the sterile room while officials made phone calls and checked databases. His flight departure time came and went. Through the small window, he watched his plane taxi down the runway without him aboard. When Morrison was finally released, David approached him with a fake smile. "I'm afraid your flight has departed. We can put you on tomorrow's flight, but only in economy class. The business class seat you claim to have booked doesn't exist in our system." Morrison knew this was a lie. He had the confirmation email on his phone, clearly showing his business class reservation. But arguing seemed pointless now. He was exhausted from the ordeal and just wanted to get home to his family. "Fine," Morrison said quietly. "Book me on tomorrow's first available flight." David handed him a new boarding pass for an economy seat on the next day's afternoon flight. The supervisor's smug expression made Morrison's blood boil, but he maintained his composure. Years of military training had taught him to control his emotions even in the most frustrating situations. As Morrison walked away from the counter, he heard David speaking to Sarah in a voice meant to carry. "You have to be careful with these people. They'll claim anything to get special treatment." The comment was the final insult. Morrison stopped walking and turned around slowly. His imposing frame and stern expression made David take a step backward. "Excuse me," Morrison said in a voice that commanded attention. "What exactly did you mean by these people?" David's face reddened, but he stood his ground. "I meant people who try to scam the airline with fake credentials." Morrison stared at him for a long moment. "I see. And you determined my credentials were fake based on what criteria exactly?" The supervisor had no good answer. His prejudice was showing clearly now, and other passengers were listening to the exchange. David mumbled something about following company policy and quickly retreated to his office. Morrison left the airport feeling angry and humiliated. This was not how a decorated soldier who had served his country with honor should be treated. He decided this incident would not go unreported. The report that changed everything. Morrison spent the night in a hotel near Heathrow Airport, his mind racing with anger and disappointment. He had served his country faithfully for over 15 years, earned multiple commendations, and protected members of the royal family with his life. Yet he had been treated like a fraud by an airline employee who seemed to judge him based on his appearance rather than his credentials. The next morning, Morrison sat in his hotel room and carefully wrote a detailed report of the incident. He documented every conversation, every insult, and every moment of the humiliation he had endured. His military training had taught him the importance of accurate record-keeping, and he wanted to ensure nothing was forgotten. At 8 a.m. sharp, Morrison called the palace security office. This time, his commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Davies, answered immediately. Davies had worked with Morrison for 8 years and knew him to be one of the most reliable and professional officers in the Royal Guard. "Captain Morrison, I was expecting your call," Davies said. "I received a message that you missed your flight yesterday." "What happened?" Morrison explained the entire incident in precise detail. He described David's suspicious attitude, the unnecessary security screening, and the degrading comments about these people. As he spoke, he could hear Davies taking notes. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Davies said firmly. "You were traveling on official royal business in your dress uniform. The airline had no right to treat you this way." Davies told Morrison to submit his written report immediately and assured him the matter would be escalated to the highest levels. Within an hour of ending the call, Morrison's detailed account was sitting on the desk of Sir Edward Young, the Queen's former private secretary who now advised King Charles. Sir Edward read the report with growing concern. He had known Morrison personally for several years and had always been impressed by the captain's professionalism and dedication. The incident described in the report was not just an insult to Morrison, but to the entire royal household he represented. By noon, Sir Edward was on the phone with the airline's corporate headquarters. He spoke directly with the chief executive officer, explaining that one of the king's personal guards had been subjected to discriminatory treatment while traveling on official business. The CEO, Margaret Thompson, was horrified to learn about the incident. She immediately launched an internal investigation and promised swift action against the employees involved. Thompson understood that offending the royal household could have serious consequences for her airline's reputation and business relationships. Meanwhile, Morrison boarded his rescheduled economy flight to Edinburgh. The flight crew, who had heard about the previous day's incident, treated him with exceptional courtesy. The captain even invited Morrison to visit the cockpit and personally apologized for his colleagues' behavior. During the flight, Morrison received several phone calls from palace officials. Each conversation made it clear that his report was being taken very seriously at the highest levels of the royal household. He was told to expect follow-up contact within 24 hours. When Morrison finally arrived home in Edinburgh, his wife Margaret could see immediately that something was wrong. Morrison rarely showed emotion, but the airline incident had clearly affected him deeply. As he described what had happened, Margaret became increasingly angry. "How dare they treat you like that?" she said. "You've risked your life serving this country. You deserve better than this nonsense." Morrison nodded grimly. "The palace is handling it now. Hopefully, something good will come from all this trouble." Neither Morrison nor his wife could have imagined how seriously the royal household would respond to the incident. Changes were already being set in motion that would reach the very top of the British monarchy. The palace investigation begins. Within 24 hours of Morrison's report reaching the palace, a full investigation was underway. King Charles himself had been briefed on the incident during his morning security briefing. The king was known for his strong views on equality and social justice, and the treatment of his royal guard deeply disturbed him. "This is completely unacceptable," King Charles told his private secretary. "Captain Morrison represents the crown when he travels in uniform. Any insult to him is an insult to this institution." The king immediately ordered a comprehensive review of how royal staff were treated when traveling on official business. He also requested that Morrison be brought to the palace for a personal meeting within the week. Meanwhile, the airline's internal investigation was revealing disturbing details about Supervisor David Wilson's behavior. Security camera footage from the airport showed Wilson's dismissive attitude and hostile body language during his interactions with Morrison. Several witnesses came forward to describe the discriminatory comments they had overheard. The airline's Human Resources Department discovered this was not Wilson's first incident involving racial bias. 3 previous complaints had been filed against him by minority passengers, but each case had been quietly settled without serious consequences. The pattern was clear and damning. Margaret Thompson, the airline CEO, realized her company faced a potential public relations disaster. The royal household had significant influence in British society, and offending them could lead to boycotts and negative publicity. She needed to act decisively to protect her company's reputation. On Wednesday morning, Thompson called an emergency meeting with her senior executives. The boardroom was tense as she explained the gravity of the situation. "We have a decorated war veteran and royal guard who was humiliated by our employee," Thompson said grimly. "The palace is involved and they are not pleased. We need immediate action to address this properly." The head of human resources recommended Wilson's immediate termination, along with additional bias training for all customer service staff. The legal department warned about potential lawsuits and suggested generous compensation for Morrison's suffering. Thompson agreed to all recommendations and went further. She decided to personally fly to Scotland to apologize to Morrison face-to-face. This unprecedented gesture would demonstrate the airline's commitment to making things right. Back at the palace, King Charles was receiving daily updates on the investigation. His staff had compiled a detailed timeline of events and were preparing recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future. The king's equerry, a senior palace official, suggested implementing new protocols for royal staff travel. All airlines used by palace personnel would need to sign agreements acknowledging the official status of uniformed royal guards and committing to respectful treatment. On Thursday afternoon, Morrison received a call that would change his perspective on the entire incident. Sir Edward Young personally invited him to meet with King Charles at Buckingham Palace the following Tuesday. "His Majesty wants to apologize personally for the treatment you received," Sir Edward explained. "The king considers this a serious matter that reflects on the entire royal household." Morrison was stunned. In his 12 years of service, he had never had a private audience with the monarch. The gesture showed just how seriously the palace was taking his complaint. That same day, Margaret Thompson arrived in Edinburgh with a small team of executives. They checked into the city's finest hotel and prepared for what would be one of the most important apology meetings in the airline's history. Morrison agreed to meet with Thompson at his home, though he remained skeptical about the airline's sincerity. Too often he had seen companies offer hollow apologies when faced with bad publicity. only to return to discriminatory practices once the attention faded. The stage was set for confrontations that would determine whether justice would truly be served or if this would become another case of corporate damage control masking deeper problems. Face-to-face with power on, Saturday morning, CEO Margaret Thompson stood at the front door of Morrison's modest Edinburgh home, flanked by two senior executives. The airline chief had rehearsed her apology during the flight north, but facing the decorated soldier in person felt more daunting than she had anticipated. Morrison opened the door wearing casual civilian clothes, but his military bearing was unmistakable. His wife, Margaret, stood beside him, her expression skeptical and protective. The couple had discussed this meeting extensively, agreeing to listen but remain cautious about empty corporate promises. "Captain Morrison, I'm Margaret Thompson, CEO of the airline," she began. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I've come to apologize personally for the unacceptable treatment you received." Morrison invited the executives into his living room, where family photos showed him in various military uniforms alongside fellow soldiers and members of the royal family. The images served as a powerful reminder of his distinguished service record. Thompson began her apology by acknowledging the severity of the discrimination Morrison had faced. She explained that Supervisor David Wilson had been terminated immediately, along with two other staff members who had failed to intervene during the incident. "We've also implemented mandatory bias training for all customer service personnel," Thompson continued. "Additionally, we're establishing new protocols specifically for military personnel and royal staff traveling on official business." Morrison listened carefully but remained largely silent. He had heard similar promises from organizations before, only to see them forgotten once public attention moved elsewhere. His wife asked pointed questions about accountability and long-term changes. Thompson then made an offer that surprised both Morrison and his wife. The airline would provide Morrison with lifetime platinum status, including first-class upgrades on all flights. They would also make a substantial donation to military charities in his name. "These gestures are appreciated," Morrison said finally, "but my concern is not personal benefits. I worry about the next soldier or minority passenger who faces discrimination from your staff. What guarantees do I have that real change will occur?" Thompson assured him that the airline was implementing quarterly reviews of discrimination complaints and had appointed a senior executive to oversee diversity and inclusion efforts. She provided written documentation of these commitments and promised regular progress reports. The meeting lasted 3 hours, with Thompson answering every question honestly and thoroughly. By the end, Morrison felt cautiously optimistic that genuine changes might occur, though he planned to monitor the airline's actions closely. On Tuesday morning, Morrison traveled to London for his audience with King Charles. Dressed in his full-dress uniform, he arrived at Buckingham Palace with a mixture of nervousness and pride. Despite years of serving the royal household, a private meeting with the monarch was an extraordinary honor. King Charles received Morrison in his private study, a room lined with books and family photographs. The king stood as Morrison entered, a gesture of respect that immediately put the captain at ease. "Captain Morrison," King Charles said warmly, "please sit down. I want to personally apologize for the disgraceful treatment you received while representing the crown." The king spoke passionately about his commitment to equality and his disappointment that one of his trusted guards had faced discrimination. He assured Morrison that new protocols were being implemented to prevent similar incidents. "Your service to this family and this nation has been exemplary," King Charles continued. "You deserve to travel with the dignity and respect that your position commands." Morrison was deeply moved by the king's personal involvement in addressing the incident. The monarch's genuine concern and concrete actions demonstrated a level of leadership that restored Morrison's faith in the institutions he served. King Charles then made an unexpected announcement. Morrison would be promoted to the rank of major and given additional responsibilities overseeing royal travel security. The promotion was both recognition of his professional excellence and acknowledgement of the injustice he had suffered. The audience lasted 45 minutes, with the king asking about Morrison's family and thanking him repeatedly for his dedicated service. As Morrison prepared to leave, King Charles shook his hand firmly and promised that discrimination against royal staff would not be tolerated. Justice served and lessons learned. 3 months after the airport incident, Major James Morrison stood in his newly appointed office at Buckingham Palace, reviewing security protocols for royal travel. His promotion had come with increased responsibilities, and the satisfaction of knowing his complaint had led to meaningful changes. The airline had kept its promises remarkably well. Quarterly reports showed a significant decrease in discrimination complaints, and the new training programs were receiving positive feedback from staff and passengers alike. CEO Margaret Thompson had personally called Morrison twice to update him on progress and seek his input on additional improvements. The terminated supervisor, David Wilson, had attempted to sue the airline for wrongful dismissal, claiming his actions were justified. However, security camera footage and witness statements made his case hopeless. The lawsuit was dismissed, and Wilson's reputation in the aviation industry was permanently damaged. More importantly, the incident had sparked broader changes throughout the British aviation sector. Other airlines had voluntarily implemented similar bias training programs and protocols for military personnel, not wanting to face the royal household's displeasure or negative publicity. Morrison's story had quietly spread through military circles, inspiring other service members to report discriminatory treatment rather than suffer in silence. His courage in speaking up had created a ripple effect that benefited countless others. King Charles continued to take personal interest in Morrison's career and well-being. During their monthly security briefings, the king often asked about Morrison's family and thanked him again for his dedicated service. The monarch's genuine concern had created a bond of mutual respect that transcended their official roles. The new travel protocols implemented by the palace were working effectively. Royal staff now carried special identification that clearly established their official status, and airlines were required to acknowledge receipt of these credentials. Any complaints about discriminatory treatment triggered immediate investigation by both the airline and palace officials. Morrison's wife Margaret had initially worried that filing the complaint might damage her husband's career prospects. Instead, his willingness to stand up for principles had enhanced his reputation within the royal household and military community. He was now seen as a leader who could be trusted to address difficult situations with courage and professionalism. On a personal level, Morrison had found peace with the incident. The humiliation and anger he had initially felt had been replaced by pride in creating positive change. His children understood that their father had made a difference not just for himself, but for others who might face similar discrimination. The airline industry publication that covered the story 6 months later focused on the positive outcomes rather than the original discrimination. Morrison was featured as an example of how proper complaint procedures could lead to meaningful reform rather than just punishment. During his first year as major, Morrison received dozens of letters from minority service members thanking him for his courage. Many described similar experiences they had faced and expressed gratitude that someone with his standing had spoken up. These letters reminded Morrison why his complaint had been so important. King Charles eventually invited Morrison and his family to a private dinner at Balmoral Castle, an honor reserved for the most trusted members of the royal household. During the evening, the king spoke eloquently about the importance of standing up for principles, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. As Morrison reflected on the entire experience, he realized that what had begun as a humiliating encounter at an airport had ultimately strengthened both his career and his character. The discrimination he had faced was wrong and painful, but his response to it had created lasting positive changes that would benefit others for years to come. The incident had also demonstrated that institutions, whether royal households or corporations, could change when faced with clear evidence of injustice. Morrison's careful documentation and professional approach had made it impossible for anyone to ignore or minimize what had happened. Today, Major Morrison continues to serve the royal family with distinction, knowing that his actions have made the travel experience more dignified for all military personnel and royal staff. His story stands as proof that courage and persistence can overcome even the most entrenched forms of discrimination.